Hello, welcome back to the Pinkham Preview Show. Slight delay to this episode due to some illness in the Pinkham camp. No injuries, thank God, heading into Saturday's game. But Connor Southwell has stepped off the substitutes bench to join me this evening. Of course, all your usual preview ahead of the long trip to Plymouth Argyle this Saturday. Of course, we want your comments, questions, score predictions, whatever it might be around this game, transfers, whatever it might be. Let us know in the comment section below. And of course, we'll get round to those in a little while. Let's start with last week, Connor, obviously a big win against West Brom. The manner of the performance and the result can maybe be a little bit different. And we've spoken a lot around the nature of the game and maybe the way it panned out and the way they managed to get the result. I suppose with that and the approach from Johannes off top, slightly more pragmatic, but the defensive side of the game, they managed to get a clean sheet that was vital. It's been obviously a root of their issues so far this season. I mean, a week on, how do you reflect, I suppose, on the approach and the way they sort of manufactured that victory on last Saturday?
Yeah, I think it's still an interesting one, isn't it? Because it wasn't a great watch, and I think Carrow Road would have reacted with boos and negativity if that would have finished goalless. And I'm sure the commentary and maybe even the sort of commentary and discourse around the way that it unfolded would be significantly different had Josh Sargent not have scored. So you have to recognise those fine margins. I think there were boos at half time. There were frustration when anti-Sinats went off. Obviously, we now know that was a dead. Have you lost me? Am I back?
You're back.
You're good. Sorry, it seems I'm having some Wi-Fi issues there. It's the lovely weather. I think it's shot Norfolk. I think you have to recognise the fine margins, of course, but equally they are at a stage of the season and in a period where they are trading only in victories at this moment in time. It's not about performances. And as Johannes Oftorp said yesterday, he didn't want to be stood, or sat in front of Paddy and yourself and others talking about, we created chances again, but we conceded chances and we've lost 2-1. So you can understand it. I can understand it. Did I like it? Not really. Would I want to see it much again? No. But I think it's probably given them a template for the upcoming games against Sunderland and Burnley. But of course, they have to get past this hurdle, and it's going to be a tricky one because Plymouth, when you play teams that are at the wrong end of the table at this time of the season, it can be just as dangerous as playing a team towards the top because they are sort of galvanised and they're sort of minds focused by what's ahead of them. And this is going to be a very testing one, I think, for Norwich City. But you would hope, and I think having spoken to Johannes yesterday, that it's going to be probably back to the norm of how they want to play, a bit more expansive, a bit more possession based, and probably a bit more attractive on the eye. And hopefully they can match that and marry that up with a result.
Yeah, of course, as you mentioned there, down at Colney yesterday, lunchtime. There's kind of a question here already from Rob, which is on a similar vein to where I was going to go. It says, afternoon, boys, do you see Nacho starting, obviously, Saturday or on the bench again, 3-game week ahead? And he was one of the players I was going to ask you about. Of course, looks like it's going to be the same squad available, albeit we always put these things in an asterisk because, we know the nature of the way this season's panned out, and there's always a surprise tends to be around the corner. But of those players that were available against West Brom, obviously going to be the same for Saturday. So does Marcelino Nunez come straight into the fold from a starting position? Obviously back and had another weeks of training, obviously pretty much changed the nature of the game with the assist for Josh Sargent late on last Saturday. So expecting him or any other changes coming into this game?
Yeah, I think he will, because I think if you want to go back to being the team that has the ball and are the protagonists and want to play the way that Johannes Oftorp wants to play, then Marcelino Nunez is a critical component of that. As you said, it's been a week further on. I think Johannes even said yesterday that he's going to be in a better position heading into this game than perhaps he was last week. And clearly there was an element of tactical sort of consideration that went into the decision to leave him on the bench last week. But we saw the impact that he had. So yeah, I think if you want to go back to that, if you're expecting the game that we're expecting, which is probably a really low, narrow Plymouth block, and that was what it was at Watford last weekend. That's how they got the point. They've played since Music has been in charge. They've played a sort of 5-4-1 and been quite narrow and really blocked off central areas. So in these type of games, it is about being patient, having a lot of the ball, exhausting teams in that defensive shape by moving them side to side quickly. And then it's about having players that when those spaces do open up, because that's ultimately what it's going to be about. It's going to be an afternoon of patience. When those spaces appears, you need quality to fizz a ball through and to find those moments of opportunity. And he is a player that, as we saw on Saturday, doesn't need much invitation to thread those type of passes through. So when you consider all of those elements, I think he's definitely one that probably needs to come back in. I think for me, the left back situation is interesting again, because clearly they are without Ben Kruzene, they are without Lucien Mahovo, they are without Callum Doyle, who I'm sure we'll speak about in a little while. and so they're going to have to find another solution. And I think Callum Fisher was good last week in that wing back role, and clearly they protected him a little bit more with that back three and offering Cordoba's pace in behind him just to mop up in case he got caught out. So I think it's that is going to be an interesting one, and I think the midfield is going to be really interesting. But I think, and I got the impression yesterday, things could change. Like you say, we spoke to Giannis very early in the week, so you can never guarantee that there's not going to be an injury surprise around the corner. But I got the impression it's going to be sort of a return to what we're used to under him, which is Norwich City dominating the ball. And if that's the case, then I think you've got to have Marcelino Nunez in there.
Yeah, a couple of players on the periphery I just wanted to ask you a little bit about. One of those is already, Rob must be kind of getting my train of thought. It is Matej Jurasek being fit enough to get any minutes in before his contract expires for 2030. That wasn't quite the nature of my question, but certainly around him, Connor, and his availability. Obviously, you did pose the question yesterday to Johannes. He kind of echoed the sentiment that he's definitely available now to come off the bench, probably for 20, 30 minutes plus. He's sort of been building on in the gym and sort of, I suppose, on the training pitch, trying to get up to that sort of levels that's required to play in the Championship. Obviously not featured since that result at Hull back in February now, so quite a while ago. And obviously one of the big players from the January haul, who probably is more of a player for next season, but obviously we want to see more of him in these last 7 games. So in terms of him and where he's at the moment, I suppose, do you expect him to be one to feature at Home Park on Saturday?
Yeah, certainly from the bench, I got that impression. I mean, it's an interesting one because I'm sure, like you, Adam, we've had people in Q&As and on these shows and all over the place sort of asking, well, how does a player build up if they're not playing games and they're not playing Championship games? How do they get used to the intensity of the league? And that's essentially the question I put to Johannes yesterday, because I think it's a valid one, and it's one that has rightfully been asked. You spend that amount of money on a player, and there is always an expectation that at the very least they come in and play and can impact things, particularly given perhaps the way that it's gone with Lewis Dobbins' injury. Norwich City have probably needed Matej Jurasek at points, and it was an interesting answer, I felt, and having looked sort of into the numbers of it and his season, he's not played a lot of football in Czechoslovakia and clearly Czech Republic, sorry, and clearly there had been there was a winter break as well. I think you need to factor him. I think his debut against Preston came pretty much 4 days short of 2 months when he last played a game for Slavia Prague. So yeah, I can understand it. I think optically it's quite hard with fans, and understandably so, because they want to see him play, and they want to see, particularly when I thought he was good at Hull and showed some real flashes of what he was about. Pace, quite a conventional winger, maybe a little bit different to the sort of profile that I anticipated. And you can also understand Johannes saying it's the adaptation to training as much as it is to games, and it's getting used to that intensity of training every day at a significantly higher level, perhaps than the Czech league. I mean, we don't follow it, so we're not probably the best person to comment. So if anyone does watch the Czech league and is watching, please let us know the intensity of it. But certainly the impression was that it's a slightly lower intensity league, and it's all very well and good training, but then it requires an extra 10-15% to take into games. And if you're not used to that, it can be very difficult. And I think also as well, you can be physically fit, as I think he was. And we saw the video of Norwich City's members of their performance team going over to Prague to train him. Just because he's physically fit doesn't mean he's ready to contribute in matches, or that his body's ready for loads, because it can be about short, sharp bursts. It can be how he deals with contact. It can be, the physicality of the league, all of these elements that maybe can impact it. So it's been a frustrating process, and I think there's no getting around that. And I think there are question marks about how it's been sort of handled since he arrived at the club. Clearly, there was a bit of a prolonged process as well, because of his situation, where with obviously the Brexit regulations and having to wait as well, that wouldn't have helped things. So yeah, it's been frustrating. You just hope over the last 7 games that we see a little bit more of him starting from Saturday. But I got the impression from what Johannes was saying, it's got to be the right situation and the right moment to throw him in. And who knows, maybe a game where Norwich City, hopefully you'd expect, would have a lot more of the ball and are going to be asking attacking questions. Hopefully they're going to be in a positive position when he comes on, and it's about maybe seeing a game out rather than having to chase it. But that would feel a lot better for him maybe than what the weekend was, where it was tight, it was on fine margins, and you don't really want to throw in a player who physically maybe is chasing their tail a little bit. So I can understand why he maybe opted to leave him out and not throw him in of that situation. So yeah, it's a complex one. I can understand why people are frustrated with it. I think we've been frustrated with it. I'm sure Jurasek has been frustrated with it. I'm sure Johannes has been frustrated with it. And hopefully, now it's about, much like Norwich, ending the season on a positive note and showing some flashes of his quality heading into pre-season.
Yeah, another player I'm sure is hoping to show some of his quality between now and the end of the season is this man who Twitchy Cherry is asking us about. That is a Mankwa Forson, who you also asked Johannes about yesterday. Had a pretty up and down, frustrating season, very stop-start. I mean, you go back to right when he arrived, the Oxford 45 minutes where I think everyone thought, oh, wait, we've got a real player on our hands here. There was the assist for Sargent against Sheffield United, then got the injury at Crystal Palace and somehow managed to feature the next weekend where it looked like it was quite a bad one. And ever since then, kind of just felt like his confidence wasn't really there. Then gets the euphoria of Coventry, and we all know what happened in that one. And Brighton, he started really well in that game before going off and hasn't featured since. So, I mean, in terms of him and his injuries and his stop-start nature of the season, Connor, how big is potentially the next 7 games for him moving forwards, particularly into next season?
Yeah, big, I think. And, it's such a shame, as you said there, it's such a shame after what happened against Coventry. It felt like a real moment for him. And, we discussed it on podcasts and videos and whatnot. Sometimes players can have those sliding doors moment. I think Johannes even said this himself. Sometimes it can make a player's career, let alone, a run of form. It felt like the first time in a considerable period where he'd had momentum. He had obviously the difficult days at Swansea where he scored an own goal, Cardiff where he was as culpable as anyone for the 2 late winners. There were other difficult performances where he's taken off at half time, particularly in that sort of one of those midfield free rolls. Didn't really feel like it worked because he was conceding possession far too regularly. They tried to play him in a bit more of a wide position, which helped, I think, and he looked a bit more of a threat and certainly got into some more attacking opportunities. And then obviously Coventry happened. I actually thought he played quite well against Brighton in the period of the game that he played in one of those 8 rolls, hit the post, and then clearly, the dead leg happens. That then becomes one where you're getting blood in a part of his body in the knee that they're struggling to manage and obviously take out, and then it's filling up again, and that becomes a bit of a frustrating process. So, yeah, I mean, for him, I guess I make 2 points. I guess there's the fitness point where he needs to get himself back physically to be in a position where he can play regularly in championship games of football. But equally, I increasingly struggle to see where he's going to fit in and where he's going to play, because if Norwich persist with this 4-3-3, that requires a lot of energy and a certain profile of player. And we've spoken perhaps a little bit about maybe the lack of creativity. I know Oscar Schwartau's been spoken about in that position. Emi Marcondes probably has done it the best we've seen this season, but no one's really grabbed it, and that is probably the one that you're looking at with him and saying, potentially for next season he could really grasp. I think it would have to become more of a 2-1 situation, and for him to be more of a 10 than probably an 8, and it would require a really solid 2 behind him, I think, because of what he's like physically and where he's at, and also probably a physical striker. I think if you were to put him now behind Sargent, then I think that could potentially be a recipe for success. Norwich don't play with that, so it's difficult. And obviously they've pushed in the 2 wingers now to be a lot closer to Sargent. They are very inverted. And that's going to be difficult for him because there are players ahead of him. Does he get in ahead of Borja Sainz? No. Does he get in ahead of Antti Sienats? No. Would he have got ahead of Lewis Dobbin? No. Mate Jurasek, it's hard when you've bought a player for that money to then push a Mankwa Forson in ahead of him potentially as well. So all of this makes it a very difficult route that he's got, but that doesn't mean it's not improbable. And pre-season, I think, is probably bigger for him than this end of the season now. It feels like this season maybe has fizzled out for him, and it's about potentially having moments and situations like in the Coventry game where he comes on and shows some positive cameos. But that's the bit for me. He really needs to, moving into year 2, nail down a position. But, we've seen it happen. I'm sure a lot of people said the same about Marco Stiepermann when he was playing as a left back in that first year. And, he emerged obviously as that brilliant number 10. So it's just about finding a role and a setup that works for him. And I think at the moment they probably haven't quite found that this season.
Indeed, see lots of comments and questions flooding through, which is brilliant to see. Keep them coming. Finley saying, is Gibbs on schedule with his work to coming back? Thought he might have featured against Arsenal. Obviously, Forson did feature in that game. You did ask Johannes around Gibbs yesterday, Connor. What's kind of the latest with him and his return to Norwich action?
Yes, I did, and all positive. Obviously, returned to training, had his first week, reacted in the way that they would have liked. I think the game, when was it? On Monday night? I think probably came a little bit too early. They travel to Everton next Monday. The under-21s have only got a couple of games left, so I'd anticipate him probably being involved with that. Likewise, a few others. I think there's probably a chance that we see maybe Lucien Mahovo in that one in some capacity, providing he returns to training on Sunday, as is the sort of mark that they've put against him as well. So he is on schedule. It's all working. I think what we're seeing at the moment is it's for him. He's not been injured for a little while. I think a lot of the work that he's been doing is about trying to safeguard against future injuries and protect his body, and strengthening work around his body to prevent some of those muscular issues that he's had, knee issues as well, that he's had during his time at Norwich that have hampered him. So it feels a lot less for me like it's about the rest of the season for him and making an impact at Championship level. I think it's more about getting his body to a place where he can be available consistently and he can get himself into squads and he can, play for the under-21s and do that, and then come back for pre-season and have a real go at it. I think that's basically where we're at with Liam Gibbs. And then obviously, clearly, if he could come back at first team level and impact things, I think that would be good, because by his own admission, he probably hasn't shown Norwich fans, after what was a very good first season in that year under Dean Smith, where he broke through and it looked excellent, probably in a deeper role. David Wagner played him all over the place, even as a striker, I think probably to the detriment of his development. And I actually think this could be a system that suited him. But obviously, when you have two major injuries, it's difficult to know exactly what he's going to be like coming back, how much of an impact he's going to make, how quickly he's going to be able to adapt. So, I think it'll be more about pre-season for him now, and hopefully next season is one where he gets a little bit of luck in his favour, because it certainly hasn't really felt like he's had that in the last couple of years. And I think we've seen enough to probably say that there's a player in there. It's just a case of whether that player can come back to the level that we saw in that first year when he won Young Player of the Season.
Indeed, yeah. Obviously, I think it was this time last week when we were doing this show, and somebody was asking around Callum Doyle and whether he's a player Norwich City can potentially try and purchase for next season, or at least have back in the building. That was a question you did pose to Johannes yesterday. Just going to play that clip now, and then we'll talk a little bit about him and where his future lies.
With him, and obviously we had this conversation with Lewis as well, but clearly where people are at, they'll begin to look at next season and begin to think about next season. He's had a lot of loans at this level. Is he one that you, in an ideal world, would like to come back? That you think there's any sort of realistic prospect of him coming back? Because clearly, at a top club like Manchester City, it can be quite difficult. What their plans are as well.
I think there's a price tag that is probably a little bit too difficult for us.
So you think it'd be the case that he'd be looking for something probably permanent rather than to go out online again?
I hope, without being his agent or supervisor or anything like that, but I hope that his next step is a club where he will be for 2, 3, 4 years. I don't think it's ideal for a young player to change club every season. To go to now he's tried to be clever about his decisions, try to find clubs where they're a little bit similar in the way they play the game, so it's not too different. But it's never ideal to go from club to club to club to club every summer and find a new environment and new teammates, and everything is brand new every summer. So I hope for him that he can find a club where it's 3, 4 years. If the price tag was realistic for us, then I hope that it will be here.
There we go. So that's Johannes Torrek's thoughts on Callum Doyle and where his future lies. I mean, what was your kind of reading, I suppose, from his response there, Connor? Probably indicates, and probably something we felt for a while, that the price tag, given what it was this time last year, around the £15 million mark, and even if it's dropped a little bit, that still feels a little bit too much for Norwich to be reaching. So is it one, I suppose, even what you said last week, is he one you'd want to see back in the building, or do you think that money could be spent better elsewhere?
Yeah, look, I think if the price was right, absolutely. But as you said, it was the talk that we were hearing last summer was £15 million if anyone wanted to buy him permanently. And I think there was a bit of an anxious wait from Norwich's end to see if anyone, particularly one of the sort of promoted Premier League clubs at that stage, would go in and pay that fee. Clearly, nobody did, and he came to Norwich City. And if it was 15 last year, I mean, I'll have to have a look. How maybe Adam, you can tell me how long's left on his Manchester City contract, but. They're still going to be in a good position. He's still only 21. He's a young guy. I agree with Johannes' assessment there. I think his next move does need to be permanent. And I think if it was in a realm where Norwich City were able to pay, I think there's probably two facets to this. There's the steepness of the price tag, but there's also the willingness from a Norwich perspective as well. I think if we were talking about a £5 million deal with add-ons to maybe take it up to 8, or maybe even towards the up end of that, towards where they paid for Sinats, an £8 million one with potentially some add-ons dependent on performance, then maybe that brings it into their ballpark at least. But then you've got to think, as we discussed on the podcast last week, you've got Jose Cordoba, who you spent money on last summer, who is your own player that you want to develop, that you really feel, Ben Apple was absolutely raving about his athleticism, his physicality, his physique, the qualities that he had to be probably a top left-sided centre-back, because if you can develop one, then very, very quickly they will become a real asset. And I think if you buy Doyle as well, does that then impede Cordoba? Do you then basically block 2 pathways instead of 1? I think you probably do. That being said, I think Norwich will, if it's not Doyle, I think they will need a left-sided one next season, because we look so much at that right centre-back slot where you've got Shane Duffy clearly still very much in the mix. You've got Brad Hills, you've got Rory McConville as well. That feels like quite a hot race heading into next summer. You then look at left side and it's just Jose Cordoba if we're talking about Callum Doyle staying at Manchester City. So they're going to need another, and I think that other one probably, I feel, maybe should be one that's maybe a little bit more experienced, a little bit of a different stage of their career than Callum Doyle. I think if the worlds aligned, and look, maybe it was really clever bargaining from Johannes Oftarup, which is a possibility when we get to this stage and things can be put out there just to try and deceive and whatnot, because I'm sure now there'll be championship clubs listening to that who maybe would have been looking at Callum Doyle thinking, well, if he's not in Norwich's ballpark, maybe he's not in ours either. So I'm sure there's some cleverness to this. So I wouldn't ever completely rule it out. And certainly the noises that you hear is that Callum Doyle's been very happy here, that he would be, open to staying if the world's aligned. But yeah, I think unless that price tag changed, I think for Norwich City, it doesn't make fiscal sense to sign him at the moment when you've got other priorities and other positions that probably feel like they need to be addressed more this summer than adding another left-sided centre-back. And I think you could probably do cheaper and possibly in a better space at the moment than Callum Doyle. That being said, he's been very good for the system. Johannes Oftarup really likes him. They put a lot of work and effort and research into signing him this time last year. So would it surprise me if those situations did align? Not really, but yeah, I think their priorities will probably be elsewhere this summer.
Yeah, contract until 2027 with a club option of another year, so 2028. So it feels like probably, it's going to be a difficult one to do, given he's, in effect, got 3 years left on his Manchester City deal. But obviously, let us know down in the comment section below. Is Callum Doyle a player you'd like to see back at Norwich this season, or next season, heading into another championship tilt more than likely? Let's talk a little bit about Plymouth, and then we'll dip into some more of these questions because they're flooding through. Cut adrift at the bottom, 7 points, as Mark says, feels like they've pretty much got to come at Norwich this weekend. The point's no use to them, which in some ways, might work in Norwich's favour. 2 straight wins going into midweek would be nice. Obviously, Sunderland, the midweek game next week at Carrow Road. So what have you made of them so far this season? Connor obviously had the year under Wayne Rooney, which you can take kind of the insight of the Plymouth end. Some of their fans felt that it was more of a PR stunt around a kind of documentary that they're potentially releasing. And I think we saw maybe his setup in its full glory at Carrow Road in that 6-1 victory. And then they've gone down a different route with Muslic, who's a little bit more of an unknown, sort of managed in Belgium for a spell and had a really good cup run, but their league form has not really drastically improved. I think he has turned it a little bit, but obviously a lot of the sides in and around them just keep winning.
Yeah, I think what you can say about them is they are a team now that are playing closer games than they were when Rooney was in charge. You look at the numbers; teams are on average creating less against them than what they were earlier on in the season. They are creating a little bit more than what they were doing. So the numbers are going the right way. It's probably a little bit too little and too late. I mean, you look at it. The last win came in February, and that was a 5-1 win against Millwall. They've lost 5-0 at home against Burnley. Sheffield Wednesday beat them 3-2. Obviously, Derby beat them. Sheffield Wednesday beat them 3-0. Derby beat them 3-2 last time out. So, yeah, who knows, to be frank, what we're going to get. But I think what you might have now is obviously that win for Derby in midweek. I'm sure will have focused minds because it's 7 points now. It's their managers come out today and described it as a must-win game, and it absolutely is as far as they are concerned. They cannot keep letting games pass them by, and probably similar to Norwich, really. It feels very unlikely that they're going to stay up. It feels very unlikely that Norwich are going to reach the playoffs. But if either team are to achieve either of those objectives, it's going to have to start soon. And those runs are going to have to start soon. And Plymouth will be looking at the home games that they have left. They've got Norwich. The next one is Sheffield United, Coventry and Leeds. I mean, those are 4 really, really tough home games to finish the season with. Obviously, teams who are, if not towards the top end of the league in Leeds and Sheffield United's case, then Coventry and Norwich are vying for playoff spots at the moment. One perhaps doing a little bit of a better job than the other. So, but they will be looking at the home form and home park to be the place where those results come, and that means probably with those remaining 3 home games that they need to beat Norwich, and they will be looking at this game where basically anything other than a win is just not acceptable. It's not enough for them really, and that does add pressure. But equally, that pressure can work against them. They can freeze. It can make life a little bit easier for Norwich to try and play on that and frustrate it. Because if you can survive what I'm sure will be, I've got a vision in my head of them coming out the traps really quickly, trying to grab an early goal. If you can weather that storm, if you can frustrate the crowd, if you can keep the ball for long periods, and just build the game slowly, and it might not be a game where you run away with it or you create buckets loads of chances, but if they can just control it and have more of the ball and create more of the opportunities and limit some of those counterattacks, and by and large I think the away performances have been better in 2025. The results might not have been, but you look at Watford where they played well, particularly first half, and managed it. Hull, I thought, barring the opening 15 minutes, they were really good. You're going to have to help me with some of the others as well. Blackburn, I thought they were really good, should have won that game. Where were they at most recently as well? Where they should have. I should have this in front of me really, but the form has been, the performances have been a little bit better, even if maybe that hasn't quite translated into results. Bristol City, of course, the one I'm forgetting, where but again, barring a really bad opening 25 minutes, they could have won that game. But that is the problem. Those bad spells are costing them. You would hope they have the quality and the capability to control a game, to create chances against a team that's bottom of the league, but they're difficult. And sometimes when you're that cut adrift and you've got to go for it and you've got to take risks, sometimes that can work in your favour and funny things can happen. So it's not going to be easy. This is going to be a really difficult game for Norwich, I think, and the way it unfolds. And it's up to them to break that, to crack that nut, to break through that defensive block and to try and create opportunities. And if we get another game like we did against Oxford and Derby, you just sense it's not beyond the realms that this could be another frustrating one for Norwich. And as Johannes said, we're in the realm really where the only currency that either team can really exchange in is a win. So I'm not sure a draw really does anything for either side, and a defeat clearly would be a big blow at this stage of the season for either of them.
I'd agree. Yeah, we'll talk a bit more around the game in just a moment. Let's dip into some of these questions, which I think are starting to maybe turn the wheel slightly towards next season. There's a couple around strikers, one maybe in and one out. Hannah asking the question, how much are Dortmund willing to pay for Ante if the leaks are true? Well, we can talk a bit more around that in a moment. And Finley saying anything true in the rumour of the Arsenal youngster. So I suppose on Ante Cianat's, Connor, I think maybe there's been a little bit of misinterpretation on that story.
Yes, I think there has been. So the way I took the story when I read it, and clearly we are translating it, and it was a story that appeared on Sky Sports Germany and was in German, so you can use different translators and they can tell you different things. I wasn't that good at GCSE German. I know Krankenhaus, which is hospital, and various others, but not enough to form a sort of translate an article into English. But my reading of it was Ante Cianats was an option for them last summer and was mentioned in January and was probably a name on a list rather than one they were actively looking to pursue this summer. Clearly, look, if Borussia Dortmund come to the table for Ante Cianats and they come with money, then Norwich City would entertain that conversation because of where they're at. I don't think that will happen. I'd be surprised, but I think it's a feather in the cap probably of Norwich's recruitment to go and find a guy who is being looked at by a club like Borussia Dortmund with the size and ability they have to uncover real talents. You look at some of the players who've gone over there and done really well, who they've uncovered. We could talk about probably Jude Bellingham being the top of that, Jadon Sancho in terms of English examples, but there are others as well dating back a long time. They are very good at talent identification, and Cianats I think has had a good season. I've maintained this. I don't think there's been flashes where maybe he's not looked that great, but certainly in terms of first year in England, as young as he is, and people forget that, he's been good. I wouldn't go beyond good, but I think he's been good, and clearly I think so much. So this is probably my two views on football at the moment more generally. I think we probably do too much, and we as fans and media, we do too much result analysis. That's my first point. I think so much of what we speak about is dictated by whether a team wins or not. Saturday's maybe a good example where it was a dire game and the analysis will be completely different, but Norwich score a 92nd minute and so it's okay. So there's a lot of that, and that's understandably so because ultimately we look at wins. And I think strikers in particular are judged too harshly on whether they score goals or not. And actually, I think there's a lot more about strikers and different. I think there's about 6 different types of strikers, so to speak. And just because a striker maybe doesn't have the best goal scoring record or hasn't scored the most goals, that doesn't make them a failure. It doesn't mean they're terrible. It doesn't mean whatever, particularly when they're that young. You're looking for sort of materials really and looking to develop them into a player. You take Josh Sargent being a prime example. He was not the player he is now when Norwich City signed him, where, you know, across the season, I think we'd all recognise he would score 20 plus championship goals, certainly at the rate that he scored them this season. It takes time to get to that. You're looking for physicality, technicality, athleticism. You're looking for those small aspects. And I think Antti Sirnats has all of those to be a really good striker in the future. And I think he's got a really good shot on him as well. I don't think he's got in, when he's got in good positions, I don't think he's made that decision to shoot regularly enough, but you could see where if he was in that position more often in the future and he got those shots away very quickly, how he could score goals and be pretty productive. So yeah, I do think that report has been taken a little bit out of context. I don't think it's that Borussia Dortmund are interested in him. I think he was a young talent that was on a list of many, and was one that probably never really entered the table, because let's be frank, if Borussia Dortmund ever entered the conversation for Antti Sirnats, he wouldn't be playing at Carrow Road.
Indeed, yeah. And in terms of the young Arsenal lad who did actually feature for Arsenal's under-21s at Carrow Road on Monday, had a couple of loans further down the sort of VFL pecking order, and maybe not, registered a senior goal yet, but, as you just referenced, you can't always read into those metrics. So in terms of him and maybe being one that could arrive at Carrow Road in the summer, is that one that fans should be wary of, I suppose, at this point?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it ticks a lot of boxes, doesn't it? He's available. He's out of contract as it stands. There's clearly the Ben Napper links. You're right. I think you do have to put those loans in context. He was at Cheltenham and Accrington Stanley, but I think started 5 times across those loans, and that's not enough really for a young player. So I wouldn't necessarily discount him on the basis of those 2 loans. Clearly, would add a bit of striker depth, wing depth as well. And, he's still at Arsenal at 22, which would indicate he's got something about him that they've wanted to keep hold of him for that long and keep him in the building. So, yeah, I think it's one to watch. I'm not definitively saying I know that he's a target, because I don't. And, sometimes it's just easier to put your hand up and say, look, I don't know. But I think it's one that you'd look at from the outside and say, yeah, that would feel like it made a lot of sense. Clearly, we'll do a little bit of digging on it over the weeks that come, and we'll try and find out a little bit more. But, it's certainly an interesting name. And, all I think is we've just hit April, and I've just now, actually, as that rumor came up, he was the first name on my summer list. I like to, when we get all the rumors, I like to stick them on a big Word document, just because it's useful to track in terms of positions and whatnot, and sort of geeky reasons. He's kickstarted my summer one already, and we're in April. And I think my last one started towards the end of May last season, but maybe that's reflective of where Norwich City are in the table.
Indeed, yeah. Some more questions, I suppose, around next season and the summer ahead. City Chat on YouTube saying, do you think Djedje could be part of the plans for us next season? Obviously, he did feature last season in pre-season, and I've always been quite impressed whenever I watched him, whether that be at under 21 level or sort of in a pre-season setting. So in terms of him and his development, obviously more of a sort of defensive utility sort of midfielder, rather than your kind of attacking midfielder of a Svartal nature or a Nunez nature. So what do you make of him and, I suppose, his progress right now? Maybe surprised he hasn't had a low move before now.
Yes and no. I mean, he only turned 19 towards the end of last month, so I think he's still very, very young. He's clearly trained a lot with the first team, and so you go back to what Johannes has said at points this season. They feel their training is as good for their development as a loan maybe to an EFL club. But I think you're right. This summer probably does feel like the time for him to go and try and see if he can get a loan move somewhere. I like him. I think physically he's a different type of profile to midfielder that Norwich have. I think technically it's probably been where the question marks have come for me at times. I think he has improved no end on that, by the way, in sort of the times I've seen him quite spaced apart. And again, if I'm him, I'm looking at pre-season as being one way, you can stamp your mark and your authority on it and try and sort of worm your way into the team. So it's going to be a big pre-season, but yeah, I think he probably does need to get himself out on loan. But he's an exciting player. He's got a contract here until 2027. So time is very much on his side. And, I think we've seen from Johannes with Mahovo and Callum Fisher, if they're good enough, they'll play. And clearly there's a reason why Djedje hasn't quite made that step yet. That's not to say he won't, but maybe he's just not quite ready right now. I know certainly last summer he was one of the crop of young players that they did like, and they did keep around the group for the majority of pre-season. So I think it's probably about timing and making sure they get it right with him.
Yeah, definitely one to watch for the future. Finley saying, as much as we need a new number one in goal next season, should the club also move to bring in a more competitive number two? I suppose we've seen quite a bit of George Long and bits of Vicente Reyes so far this season. So I suppose in terms of that goalkeeping department, Connor, moving into the summer, it does feel like quite an important area.
Yeah, and clearly, you've got the situation with Angus Gunn as well, which hasn't been resolved, and I don't think is any closer to being resolved as we sit here today. Look, I think so. This is an interesting one because I can see where people are going with it, and I can see that there's a big gap between Angus Gunn and George Long when they play, even when Angus has had maybe the season that hasn't been his best by all of our acknowledgement. There's a few factors I think to remember here, which is that in George Long they've got someone who's homegrown. That's really important for Championship squads, and if you can have basically both of your goalkeepers being homegrown, then that is a long way to fulfilling your quota in a matchday squad. I think it's 8 that you have to have in a match, or 7, and sort of club grown player. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure those are the regulations. So they are quite high in the EFL. So if you can have a backup deputy goalkeeper that is homegrown, it doesn't half help. He's good for the group, which is what you need, because they've had examples in the past with backup goalkeepers who have come in and maybe have very quickly got frustrated that they haven't been playing. George Long has never done that, and he's cheap, quite frankly. So, any money that you spend on improving your number two is money that you take out of improving another position, and realistically, the aim for George Long, let's put this in context, really, is that he doesn't play for Norwich. The aim is that they have a number one who's good enough to play and available enough to play every game. And again, maybe that is a mark in Angus Gunn's column that he hasn't quite been able to keep himself fit over the last couple of seasons at various points. It's not his fault. It happens. But, from a goalkeeper, you'd want them to play ideally 46 games. And if you do that, then George Long never plays a game of football, and he's just there to provide competition. And, we saw how expensive, but also how unhelpful probably the cruel gun debate was for a long period, where they had 2 goalkeepers that are of the same quality. So, for me, I think I'd focus on the number one and improving that position. And I think that's where the real priority is. And if George Long has to play, we're talking hopefully about a real handful of games. And you hopefully are putting him in a team next season where the defensive structure is a lot better and he's a lot better protected than maybe he has been at points this season. So I wouldn't say it's a priority. It would be a nice bonus if they could do it, but clearly I think the priority, if they don't improve Angus Gunn's contract, is to try and improve that position, because in an ideal world, if you get someone or Angus himself signs a new contract and is available for 46 games, we're not talking about George Long because he won't be playing. So that has to be the aim, I think, rather than focusing on that position. I think it's a little bit easy and probably not very realistic for a club without parachute payments to go and improve their second goalkeeper, because as soon as you do that, realistically, you're signing someone who thinks they should play number one and should play every week. And that can upset the dynamic. That can sometimes do more damage than having someone of maybe lesser quality, but who's a good egg around the place. And I know that's frustrating for fans because we want to see the best players and lots of competition. But, if they're spending, let's say, $5,000 more on a second goalkeeper per week, well, that's $5,000. I'm sort of making the numbers up, plucking them from thin air. But as an example, that's then money that they are taking from another position elsewhere. I would rather they use that to strengthen other areas of the team that need it, including probably first choice goalkeeper.
I'd agree with you. Rob, going back to the point we were speaking around earlier, deal or no deal, you can buy Callum Dorr for 10 million.
Nah, it's too rich for my blood, I think, Adam. What about you?
Yeah, I think anything sort of above 7 with add-ons, I think, would be tough given the market and the way Norwich are operating at the moment. There's probably better value elsewhere if that's the point. Around centre back, still there's a couple of questions around some of those maybe younger lads. Aidzo saying thoughts on McConville, and he also goes on to say, does Brad Hills come in and start straight away, or do you think Stockport might buy him? There's obviously hope here that Brad Hills might stay from this individual. So, I mean, in terms of those maybe centre-backs on the fringes, where do you stand on, so if Brad Hills, who's doing exceptionally well at Stockport? I know he had the red card the other week, but you look at kind of any bits on social media and you look into his stats, and he's having an excellent time there in a team that's flourishing and playing well at the top end of League One in and around the playoffs. And then McConville, you had a chat with him obviously on our channels that if people haven't already gone and listened to, that they can. So in terms of those two, where do they maybe fit into the picture for next season?
Yeah, I'm really pleased for Brad Hills, because I think it was a really frustrating opening period of the season for him when you've maybe had a really good loan elsewhere. I remember speaking to him at Accrington last season, and he said to me, look, I need to be playing football next year. I want to be playing football next year. When you get a taste for it, it's then very hard to have half a year like he did, albeit I'm sure it would have really helped his development. So it is difficult, and it can be really difficult to manage that type of situation. And I think there are examples this year of Norwich City not getting loans right and putting players in not very good situations and at clubs where maybe they haven't played a lot. I think you can look at Kennebo and the decisions that have been made around him on 2 occasions, really, as being quite disappointing. They've got the Brad Hills one spot on in terms of level of club and, you know, his ability to go in there and really impact things. I'm really excited by Brad Hills, to be honest. I have been for a couple of years. I think he is everything you want in a modern centre back. He's big. He can do kind of the traditional dirty stuff that you like, but he can also play. And you know, he's not a Callum Doyle. He's not a brilliant ball player who's going to rack up assists and break lines, but he's capable enough. And you know, add in, I think, probably the sprinkle in the romantic aspect. What does that mean in the grand scheme of things, of him being a Norwich City fan and a Norfolk boy? And you know, it would be lovely, I think, to see him play for Norwich City and to play for Norwich City for a long time. And I think he's got the capability to do that. I think he'll be playing, you know, as Johannes said, I think he'll be playing Championship football next season, whether that's with Norwich City or on loan elsewhere. But this is someone that I think will play a lot of games for Norwich and will come back in at some point. You have to try and bridge that gap. And I think this summer feels like a really good opportunity. We keep speaking about pre-season. He had a really good pre-season last summer. I think he was really unlucky not to perhaps be a little bit further up the pecking order than he was in the end. But clearly his presence enabled them to feel comfortable enough to let Grant Hanley go, because they felt Hills could step into that role. And I think it's a real opportunity for him, because clearly Shane Duffy is going to be in the last 12 months. There's going to be a lot of discussion around him, I'm sure, this summer. And, you know, if Brad Hills can step into that void in pre-season and really perform for Norwich, you know, why can't he step into the team next year? Why can't he be a viable option alongside a Cordoba? I think that could be a really exciting partnership. Of course, it has to be right. We speak about timing. It can be as damaging for a young player if you throw them in too early. But, you know, he's proving at League One level that he's more than capable of playing very, very, very well. So you'd hope that could translate into Championship football. And, you know, I think there's been flashes where he's looked a little bit nervous when he played for Norwich at a senior level this year, but I think the fact he's had those experiences hopefully will have helped. So, yeah, I think Brad Hills could be one to watch next season, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I agree. We're live for another sort of 10 minutes or so. So any more comments, questions, get them down below. Finley saying, does it feel like Sorenson getting a new contract is looking more of a possibility? I mean, you did ask that question as well yesterday around maybe him being selected over a McConville or Jacob Wright, who are maybe two that probably have a longer-term future at Norwich, hopefully with Wright. Obviously, if Norwich decide to get the option over the line and all the stars align with him and his sort of agents. But in terms of the response on him and Sorenson's future, what do you kind of, I suppose, what are your inclinations and your feelings around him? Is he one you could see being part of the plans for next campaign?
Yeah, I think the more he plays, the more likely it comes, right? And you know, I know what Johannes said yesterday in terms of it's not a consideration, but equally, do you continue to play a player that you've got no, you know, reason that or no thought process that he's going to be here next season? I don't think you do, really. You know, we're certainly not in those realms when we're talking about Onel Hernandez, maybe even an Emi Marcondes at this stage. But to be fair, we are speaking about that with Angus Gunn. That is someone who's out of contract, might not be here next season, and he isn't centred. You know, he isn't a centre of a debate in the same way that Sorenson is. Clearly, that's because of the options of you know, maybe what Angus Gunn has got behind him compared to what Jakob Sorensen has got behind him, and I understand that, and I can understand Johannes as well, because he still has to pick his best team, and at this moment of time, as he explained yesterday, they don't feel like they can be 100% sure what Rory McConville is going to offer them, or what Jacob Wright is going to offer them in certain games. And clearly, the way they went last weekend wasn't really his game. I thought Jacob Wright came on and was excellent, by the way. It sort of went under the radar a little bit, and I think generally he's been good for Norwich and shown real promise, probably barring that first night at Preston where it was a bit of a baptism of fire for him. So, yeah, look, I can understand why fans are frustrated by it and by him, because I think it's difficult when you watch a game to know what he does. He's not somebody who gets loads of goals and assists. I think there's a feeling inside the club, not necessarily that I would agree with this, that he's someone that you can drop in and it helps other players push forward and give them the freedom, because he provides a little bit of a structure. And look, who are we to say we don't have coaching badges? We, you know, and 4 Norwich City coaches on the spin have all liked him and have all played him. and that must say something. He's not the disaster footballer that people will make him out to be. That's not to say he's brilliant and he's the best option that Norwich City have. I think he's fine as a player. Do I think they've got better options? I do, but equally, if they're real about going for the playoffs, then I can understand why Johannes Oftorp would play him, because it's about maybe fielding what you feel is your best team at the moment and what's capable of doing a job. And sometimes that is about balance and combinations and, what helps other players succeed rather than simply who are your best players. No coach probably, Guardiola wouldn't pick his best 11 players. It's what represents the best team. And that might mean a player in a certain position where you're scratching your head a little bit going, well, why are they in there? But there will always be reasons and justifications. We don't see how he trains. He might be the best trainer in the world and be the best player every week. We don't see that. We don't know. We don't know what the tactical plans are. There might be an opposition reason he's in the team. So, yeah, look, I get the frustration. I get it. I've said this a few times. I know Paddy's been very vocal on this, and I probably agree with him. I think he was probably fortunate to get a contract last summer with his injury situation. I think he's obviously suffered with them again. It's not his fault. It just happens. And at some point, I think Norwich do have to move away from him, if I'm being honest, and probably from others in that group who are contracted. And he feels probably very much like the past rather than the future. And I think that probably is it. It's not Sorenson as a player or him per se. It's probably about what he represents. And from that, I can totally understand, because you look at him and is he a player that feels like he's going to be part of a team that really gets Norwich City up the table? Not really. And that's not to be disrespectful to him, because I think there have been good flashes and good signs. But I think probably his strength of playing a number of positions is ultimately probably going against him at the moment with the fan base. Indeed,
yeah. Rob asking the question, if you could keep one of Sargent signed on Nunez this summer, which one would it be, guys? I mean, that is a cracking question, because I suppose there's sort of speculation around all of them and their futures, and not Signs and Nunez both out of contract next season. So does that come into the equation? So where's your head at in terms of that one, Connor?
Sargent, I think. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I would probably just veer for Nunez. I just think in terms of, I mean, both of them obviously.
Those are the two I was torn between, to be fair.
Yeah, I think the injuries obviously come into play with both of those. If you could guarantee Sargent fitness for every game over the course of a season, I think it's an absolute no-brainer, because you're guaranteed goals, and that's key in any team that tries to push for the playoffs or promotion, wherever it might be. Obviously, Norwich had Pukki in previous campaigns, they've had Holt in previous campaigns. Ewan Roberts and etc. Going down the years, you always need a striker. But I just think Nunez, in terms of, I know it's fitness issues as well, but the ball he played through to Sargent the other day, if Sienats can take the mantle up front next season and you've got Nunez still threading those balls through, then I think there's an exciting proposition. So I just edge towards Nunez. But obviously, if anyone else has any opinions, definitely get them down below.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, I'm sure you saw this, Adam. I don't know if anyone watching saw this, but Chris Sutton wrote a column in the week about Josh Sargent, basically saying how for his own career he needs to go elsewhere and to go and play and test himself at a higher level. I think there's probably a lot of truth in that, if I'm being honest. As uncomfortable as it is for everyone to hear, because we all have loved watching Josh Sargent develop. But yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on him? Because I must admit, and I understand there's a lot of emotion into this, but I've been surprised maybe by how many people think that Norwich City might be able to keep him, or this idea that you just sort of throw money at him, because he's got to want to sign it, and I'm sure his headspace is, with a World Cup on the horizon, there's going to be interest in him this summer, inevitably. I'm not sure what purpose a fourth year in the Championship does for him, even if Norwich City have the best project in the world, really. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the World Cup element is big. Obviously, he'll want to try and get himself in a position where he is probably the first choice for the US. Obviously, it is kind of a homecoming of extent in terms of it being based in the US, Canada, Mexico. It feels like he'll want to be involved in that with some form of capacity. And another season in the Championship, as you say, he's done it now for 3 years and proved himself at this level. He can't really prove himself anymore. And my concern is, if you get to the start of next season, he's out for another 6 months. If he does pick up an injury, which, let's be honest, you can't rule it out given his history, then you're looking at the value decreasing and going down further. And again, it's blocking those pathways. We've spoken around that with a lot of these individuals, and you spoke around Doyle maybe blocking Cordoba a little bit. I think we're seeing that's now starting to prove himself a little bit more in the second half of the season. There's going to have to be an opportunity for him at some point in that number 9 role, which Sargent had to wait for Pukki to move on. Maybe Sienats needs to wait for Sargent to move on to get that opportunity, as sort of the regular starter every week. And Sargent, if you can get 20 plus million pounds for him, and Norwich can be shrewd with the way they reinvest the money, and they do manage to recruit another younger type to hopefully develop for the future, then I think they need to spread the goals out next season more anyway. I don't think you can be as reliant on Josh Sargent and his quality as we saw last season. That was ultimately the key to their downfall. And then when it came to the second half of the season, his goals fired him into the playoffs. It's kind of been the same this season. When he's not been available, they've struggled. So for those reasons, I just think it's a natural part in other ways. And this summer feels about right. His contract, I think it's 2028. So Norwich should be able to get a pretty good value, you'd hope, even with the injury elements and the fact he scored so many goals. So, for me, the time just about feels right, as much as I don't want to admit it.
Yes, no, I completely agree. And I think it's tough because clearly, we all want to see Norwich keep their best players, but I think Ben Napper has spoken about this. I think selling a player like Josh Sargent or even Borja Sainz, to be fair, it doesn't need to be a sign that they're heading in the wrong direction. You look at Brentford when they were at this level, they sold Ollie Watkins, they sold Ben Rama, they sold other players, who did they replace Watkins with? Ivan Toney, and that was okay. And, Norwich sold Maddison. Who did they replace him with? Emi Buendia. So part of this is about recruitment, and they've got to make sure their recruitment is in a good place and is ready. And I'm sure they already have done a considerable amount of work to ensure that if Josh Sargent goes, if Sainz goes, if Nunez goes, they are ready and primed with targets and lots of names on the list that they're ready to recruit for. And ultimately, how those guys get on and succeed or not will ultimately be the judge of whether they were right to sell those players. And that is the sort of equation and plates that Ben Napper has got to spin this summer.
Yeah, before I get your score prediction, just a word for those fans making the trip to Plymouth, Connor. I mean, Johannes was very complimentary and, showed his gratitude and how impressed he's been with the fans on the road this season. The numbers they took to Bristol and the fact that he had all these numbers at pre-season at Northampton on, the first game. And, he almost couldn't believe his eyes at how many people have been even in the overseas camps, earlier on in the pre-season. So, looking at the trip ahead, I mean, even we're kind of looking at it being like, oh, God, that is a long old way. So those that are dedicating one of the, a full day pretty much on the road with the game and all the travel and all the cost that comes with it, I mean, you've got to be pretty balmy to be doing it.
Yeah, you have. I don't know what that makes us, but I think you haven't. And, fair play to anybody who's making the trip to Plymouth this weekend from a Norwich City persuasion. It's a long way anywhere from Norfolk really, but particularly to Plymouth. And I know those guys feel it, probably similarly, probably more than we do in terms of how much travel they have to do away from home this season. But it's a long trip, and there's only one thing you can really hope for them, and that's that they get a win, because that's what Norwich City need, and that's what their efforts and their travel will deserve. And if Norwich City can do that, then those 6.5 hours on a coach or in a car or on a train won't feel anywhere near as bad on the way back if you're boosted by a victory and 3 points that we all hope, if you look at the fixtures, could potentially, I think it's probably more likely to be 3, but in a sort of a most realistic example, but in the best case scenario, it could be 2 points outside the playoffs, and then it really is game on with 6 games to go. So that is what you've got to hope. But they've been fantastic. They are fantastic. We say it every time. And yeah, I really, really hope they are rewarded, particularly after what we saw at Plymouth last season. I don't think any of us want a repeat of that, because as lovely as Devon is, as nice as Plymouth was, I think I got a bit sick of it once the 4th goal went in, if I'm honest, last season. So if we can avoid a repeat of that, that would be smashing.
Yeah, Hannah was giving Norwich one more extra goal than they got last year. 6, Norwich 3 with Jurasek and a Sargent double. Statesman's bald head. Could we beat Plymouth 6-2 at home park this time round? Obviously, they kind of got the revenge, I think, earlier in the season at Carrow Road with the 6-1. So I've seen a 4-4. Plenty of goals flying in here from the viewers. So where do you sit on it, Connor? How do you see this game on Saturday? Also, as you sort of referenced at the top, it feels like probably last chance saloon for both in terms of their objectives for this season. So with all that and everything we've spoken around in the last almost hour, how do you see the game and the score prediction from you?
Norwich have got to win. I think Norwich will win. I think we're at that point of the season now where the players' minds will be very focused. You hope they're boosted by what happened last weekend against West Brom. I think they'll have hopefully too much, and hopefully they can protect themselves on the counter-attack and with set pieces. And I think they will win 2-1. What about you, Adam?
Yeah, I think they might get a win here as well. As much as Plymouth are going to have to come out swinging and fighting, just think the quality. We spoke there about Sargent, Nunez, and Signs. Those three individuals alone are enough to win games in the Championship, and I'm hoping Norwich can deal with the. It's going to be a slightly different game, I think, to what we had this time last year. That was in September, and Plymouth had started the season well. They had Morgan Whittaker scoring goals left, right, and centre. It feels like they're in a very different place this time. So, hoping Norwich can capitalise on that. I'm going to go for a Norwich 3, Plymouth 1, which I think
nice.
We'd take that. 3 points would make that long trip home slightly less treacherous and long, as much as we had to deal with it last year after the 6-2. So fingers crossed for anyone making that journey. It's a safe trip down, and Norwich can reward you for your loyalty and the endeavour and the trip you've had to make there, because we know all too well how long it is. Plenty of good content, obviously, across our channels heading into this game. I spoke to a Plymouth fan earlier this week, so that's now live up on our YouTube channels to get a little bit more insight on the Pilgrims. Connor caught up with a Norwich City midfielder that I think we all loved from that sort of Paul Lambert time. David Fox obviously played for both clubs, so a little bit more of a sort of feature, I suppose, with him in terms of how he sees this game. At the weekend, we were obviously down at Colney yesterday speaking to Johannes Torp, so the full press conference is available on the YouTube channel as well. We'll have Tactics Board hopefully in the morning if Sam's fit and available to do that. We'll also have all the good stuff across the Pink and app as well. We've also got Chris Sutton's column, Ewan Roberts, Chris Gorham, all the usual characters that produce pretty good quality content. Of course, also the guys as well. So all the build up for this game will also be on there, and of course we'll be at Home Park on Saturday afternoon, Team News Live from 2 p.m, all the coverage on the Pink and Plus app as well. So join us over there. If you're not making the trip, let's hope Norwich City can make this weekend a good one and bathe in the sunshine down in Devon, and hopefully, of course, it's a little bit better than the last time we made the trip there. Enjoy the rest of your evening, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you in the next one.